All right, perfect. So, for everybody who is here, IFF is Internet Freedom Foundation is a digital liberties organization that seeks to ensure that technology respects fundamental rights. And their goal is to ensure that Indian citizens can use the internet with liberties guaranteed by the Constitution. And Apar with us, who has joined us here, um, he was a co-founder at IFF, and he works in the capacity of the executive director now. Um, they started with Save the Internet campaign, but I think what interests me most is the first few litigations that you took up around Section 66A of the Act,
Yeah.
um, and all the cases that you took up, which led you to start IFF. So that's what interests me.
Yes.
Um, some of the issues that IFF works right now are on censorship and free expression, online privacy, recent issues like inequality in internet access, especially due to rural-urban divide or the divide between men and women. So,
And also, Shivangni, much more recently, so our mandate is any kind of interaction between technology and human rights. So essentially, that derives from our constitutional understanding of why the constitution was made. And it's a fundamental reordering of power towards the individual, especially the ones who are most disadvantaged, because um, they will need human rights because it provides a level of equalization of political power, bargaining power, which they may not have due to their identity, their place in society, their economic privilege. So we are also working on specific issues of medical healthcare privacy now,
mhm,
or the pandemic forcing us to, as you mentioned, about issues of equality, but also access, let's say, about vaccination, right? What happens to people who are 18 to 45 who are not part of the digital revolution, so as to say? And how do they get inoculated when a policy itself is requiring compulsory registration with the online portal? So that's one tangible explanation also about how digital systems and policy and governance processes may be leading to exclusion as much as they may be facilitative in their scope. So it's medical healthcare privacy, it's about inclusion, it's about AI-based discrimination, facial recognition. So it's a brave new world.
true, true. I think that issue was fairly, prominent when they asked us to register and walk-ins were not allowed for
Exactly.
vaccination. And then the
Exactly.
second issue, which also came up, was around Aadhaar, mandating
Yes.
Aadhaar. So, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So yesterday, for I think about 2 days back, Delhi government published a circular that they have started home delivery of oxygen through a
Hmm.
centralized portal, which requires the mandatory provision of Aadhaar as per the circular. However, the portal itself does provide for one more alternative ID. Now, the reason is that Aadhaar by itself is not there with everyone as much as people may think everyone has it. And secondly, to require people to give Aadhaar for a life-saving service quite often may also pose challenges for those who have Aadhaar. That is because quite often the details in the Aadhaar may not match the details that they may have. And all of us have one or two errors or that really awful picture in our Aadhaar cards, uh, which evokes and is the source of constant jokes, but it becomes a little more serious. Uh, the final layer of exclusion with a digital based system is when digital identity is also required in terms of biometrics, like a thumbprint or eye scan, for a process of authentication prior to the service delivery itself. And that is done, for instance, for PDS rations. And this is a technological qualification which quite often doesn't work outside test environments where network connections are not the best, and they're not the best even in Delhi. We know We sometimes do search for signal even now, as much as people do not venture out, but even then the quality is variable. And imagine that a person is going rapidly through their rice grains and their cooking fuel, and a biometric authentication service is down, and we all know the official nomenclature server is down. Okay.
Yeah.
What happens? Do they get their food? There are actual instances of people climbing trees, scaling small hills to ensure better internet connectivity with point of authentication devices, so as to say. So, complex, layered technologies, which are quite often seen by us as solutions, may actually pose greater problems. This comes from James Scott's work on seeing like the state, on central planning as well. Central planning quite often relies on statistical reduction in terms of prescribing value to individuals and then plotting it for the purposes of planning. So central planners are not essentially, it's not a critique of central planning by itself. It's an explanation why centralized planning results in certain unintended outcomes, and sometimes solutions by itself lead to the creation of another set and layer of problems. And this is where human rights and digital rights comes in, to mitigate the impacts of technology for all its promises or efficiency, to also not lead to the kind of exclusion for the most marginalized and the most excluded, as is a vision of the Indian constitution towards greater degrees of social justice.
Fair point. And I think COVID-19 has like just increased that divide to another extent, which was not even visible earlier. Earlier, there were NGOs who were able to provide that kind of service, or there were at least like community spaces where people would go and access certain um, internet possibilities. But now, even that has that's not a possibility for people as well.
Yes, so the pandemic has made several situations very, very bad. Uh, for instance, internet shutdowns are still being impacted. And how do they impact people is very severe in a pandemic, as opposed to when uh, people can negotiate with the internet shutdown, which is the total termination of any kind of access to any website whatsoever by a specific mode of connectivity. More often than not, 4G based internet connectivity over our smartphones. So, this kind of disconnection during a pandemic results in a snap of remote learning, which is necessary for students, for even uh, personal relationships, which require on video calling to give a certain degree of intimacy, right? We want to see the person who we are talking to, and telemedicine very immediately. I would say that this has been a issue which has been, one tangible demonstration of it has been in the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, where after the state reorganization repeal of Article 370, there was a internet shutdown, which started with the telecommunication shutdown of no phone connections, and then was in the last leg, 4G ban on internet connectivity, which is predominant mode of access of internet across India, for a total period of more than 550 days. And people approached the Supreme Court. Petitioners included the Jammu and Kashmir Private Schools Association, journalists as well. So news gathering is also impacted, for instance. But yeah, the pandemic has made things much more challenging, much more severe, much more uncertain. And certainly this is not normal. This is extraordinary. This is something which is not built for human function.
True. Um, so as we talk about like these are basic internet freedom rights that we expect in this digital age. Now, another point is around online privacy, which I don't think most of us who are privileged, who have the access, even think about, even consider, because the apps that we download or the kind of uh, websites that we use, all of them seek our privacy without our consent. Otherwise, we just can't use their service. Can you elaborate a little bit on what kind of privacy breaches do people face today, which we are not aware of or not thinking about?
So, Achal, what the first thing which people think about privacy is my data is getting leaked. Okay, and they usually care about this as a much more popular issue, and uh, they see their details being revealed online, and that's a good reason for that. Of course, it's a reputational risk in terms of whatever information is about you, and you feel creeped out. But it also is a potential cybersecurity threat, given that somebody can use that information to cause you real tangible harm. Real in quotes, everything is real. So it may be in terms of somebody impersonating you and using those points of information to gain access to your banking accounts and doing unauthorized transfers, thereby depriving you of your savings. But we need to conceptually understand privacy as being something a little much more broader and larger. And this comes through, as also explained by the Supreme Court in the right to privacy judgment, which is the first Puttaswamy judgment. There are two judgments which are the product of the Aadhaar litigation. One is answering the question whether privacy is a fundamental right, which is the first judgment. And the Supreme Court unanimously, about 9 judges, say yes, it's a fundamental right. They link it to all the fundamental rights. The second judgment is then the application of that legal principle and that answer that privacy is a fundamental right to the Aadhaar project as to is the right to privacy actually violated by the Aadhaar project? That's the second Puttaswamy judgment. So, in the first Puttaswamy judgment, which is the right to privacy judgment, the privacy is considered very conceptually, firstly in philosophical terms, and Justice Chandrachud's opinion, which has the highest number of signatures of companion judges of the Supreme Court. And you can read it with other opinions as well. But it relies on philosophical uh, terms such as uh, autonomy, your ability of individual decision making, what I can dress, what I can eat, what I can drink, what I can wear, which colors do I like, who do I hang out with, right? Autonomy, dignity, who am I? Um, uh, how do others behave with me? What is the kind of information I can keep to myself so others treat me in a better way? If people know about my caste background and me being marginalized, or my caste being uh, conventionally purposed in society towards certain functions, what stereotypes would they prescribe to me, especially when I'm disadvantaged or Harijan? Or Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi. Uh, and liberty, finally. So, autonomy, dignity, liberty. Liberty is much easily understood. What can I do? Where can I go? But what you notice is there's almost a seamless overlap between these philosophical concepts. And what is this overlap is very hard to order, neatly cut, measure, and precisely then define that these are individual blocks and bricks we're keeping. So you should need to think about it as a much more collective, um, uh, uh, collective uh, uh, sculpture in a sense, where you can't divide them. And this collective sculpture of privacy is displayed all through in each one of our fundamental rights, where it is also pronounced in individual decision making about sexual identity, um, and gender, which is today understood to be a larger spectrum. Privacy at the same point in time, and the judges are very conscious here. They say that it is also informational privacy. How much information I allow others to have in what context. So it's not merely private or public, and you retain constant autonomy over it. So you can consent for it for A purpose, for B time period, to C person. Okay. And you can also determine that if that personal information which is identifiable to you, what inferences they may be able to take, how they can use that information then. So informational privacy starts from the point of decision making, that who gets to have your personal information, not from the point of the breach, which is where people like us usually get most alarmed. Now, the second thing is the underlying cynicism. We don't care, Indians don't care about their personal privacy. I think Indians care very, very highly about their personal privacy. On this call by itself, uh, if you notice, Achal, uh, people have switched off their cameras. They're
Right.
displaying their names, but they're switched off their cameras. So they're deciding how much they want to participate. Some have chosen even display pictures for themselves. For instance, I see Rochan has done it.
Right.
Hi, I hope we can talk later. So think about this. You're making these decisions, and this is an extension of privacy. Privacy doesn't need to be something very sinister, where about tax records or something very serious. It's about the little things actually, and it's
Right.
the little things quite often in our digital world which mean so much and add up to so much.
Right. Um, so now my question is that, one, while we say that we have these rights and we can start from the point of decision making, is it really happening? Like, do we really, are we able to exercise those rights? Because I don't think I am exercising those rights.
So let me pose it now to a lot of people. I've been doing this work for about 3.5 to 4 years. So let me start from where we started. We started from uh, privacy is a right in, which was a campaign when the Supreme Court case was going on, and the union government had argued that privacy is not a fundamental right. In which close to about 200 people, including a lot of academics, came together and said, "What the hell? We are in the how can you even make the argument that privacy is not a human right? That's such a regressive notion." And today we are discussing a data protection law. You have the National Economic Survey saying that, yeah, privacy is a concern for elites, but at the same point in time indicating that it is an issue. There are multiple government departments putting out policy positions. Any Niti Aayog paper, for all its criticisms, which we at IFF engage very, very deeply with, and we say that it's so quite often we found them to be very, very deficient in its intellectual depth or in terms of policy prescription, yet at the same time considers privacy. So there's inadequate consideration. You may say there's lip service, but that grammar has at least reached our tongues. And let me give you the second practical example, which comes through again, privacy is the right. After that, we launched the Save Our Privacy campaign. Okay. There are about 14,000, 15,000 signatures on it, etc. This, that. So to launch that campaign, we did a kickoff video. We are much more as an organization into public advocacy and community organizing rather than long form research such as other institutions, because that is where the institutional gap in India was. You didn't have an organization like the ACLU, the EFF, Liberty, Open Rights Group, people who can organize people, who can break down this research which is coming from our faculties, academics, or the people who write these wonderful papers spread across research institutions like Center for Communications Governance, the Internet Democracy Project, Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore. So many friends who are doing this kind of work. But the thing is that you needed a champion, an advocate, to very clearly utilize their learnings, their deliberative processes, and involve the larger public also. The kickoff video for Seva Privacy was done by Dhruv Rathi.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And while you may not agree with all of his politics, you will agree with one thing. And we went with him specifically because he appeals to an audience which is not me, which is not surrounded by all these books. He talks and he breaks down concepts which are very complex in easy, simplified, relatable uh, language, which is much more accessible to a English crowd, right?
Right.
So that video had the lowest number of views for a Dhruv Rathi video. So I'll leave you with that. But when was it? It was about 2.5, 3 years back.
Mhm.
And BuzzFeed made videos, lowest number of videos, viewer numbers for BuzzFeed. So it was fitting both demographics and multiple videos with Bloomberg Quaint. We did so many videos through different distribution and networking channels. So it's not like, oh, Dhruv was having an off day or kya kehte hain, the BuzzFeed creators couldn't run with it better. The thing is that privacy was just developing. So it takes time, and we need to permit ourselves time and patience for political values to translate into practiced culture, social culture, individual action. So let's be generous to ourselves. Let's be a little less cynical. The third and the final example is a demonstration of how people now do recognize privacy. Not completely, incompletely to some degree. You remember the WhatsApp privacy change? It's for the
That's what I
first
was
time.
thinking about. Yeah.
It's for the first time. It's for the first time I have relatives who think I'm doing anything of value in the world. Okay, because you made an infographic. For the first time, they understand what are digital rights, even though they always say kuch karta hai wo. So that's the description of everything which IFF does or digital rights is. But I found that to be so cool that I had people who were asking, is this WhatsApp group safe? Can
Right.
they read my messages? And I was like, wow, you do care about your privacy as much as you think you don't. The final thing to end this is, um, the easiest way to make somebody care about their privacy is ask them to turn over their unlock smartphone to you. So if anybody says I don't have anything to hide, just say proof.
Fair, fair. You mentioned somewhere about community mobilization and getting signatures. Now, my question is, does that really make a difference? Because there are so many change.org campaigns and petitions, and we can sign, but does it really make a difference when the concerned authority that we are writing to or that we are asking to change their behavior is government or a big corporation?
Okay, so there are a few things to consider here, and I taken my learnings from this booklet on community organizing, which is called Rules for Radicals. Okay, and somebody recently asked me this question: why do civil society organizations do joint letters? Like, who even reads them, right?
Mhm.
And I was like, actually, I used to be a skeptic about them, but I've seen in practical terms uh, them being useful.
Mhm.
Actually, being useful also in getting changes, even with thick-skinned public officials or corporations who have very high interests. And Rules for Radicals is not a book about idealism. It's a book about the practical realities and how do you work with larger system-based incentives to make sure that you employ the tactics which are necessary for you to reach your goals as people who care about social justice. Okay, so petitions by themselves, if you gather a high number of signatures, they don't help by themselves, but they're a very useful strategy in activating a larger community of greater civic literacy, of ensuring then that if you can organize that community and take it towards collective action by itself. So why are young climate justice campaigners so prominent and getting such large amounts of media attention? It's not because of Greta Thunberg, it's because they employ what is called as full court advocacy. They employ mass emailers, signature campaigns, physical climate justice strikes, digital tools of organizing as well, such as Twitter storms. They then centralize their demand by engagement with public institutions consistently, responsibly, and they hope for the best. Now, of course, you won't get the changes tomorrow, but what you have done and achieved is you have captured media attention, you're part of the conversation. Secondly, you centralized your demand as a governance demand, you're no longer off the table. And third, now you need to get a seat on the table. It'll be a small seat, it'll be the baby seat, okay? And you won't fit in there. But here's the thing, that's where you start. And let's not forget any time, there are no complete winners in a democracy. Oppression quite often wins as much as social justice. That's what I like to remind myself just through a very impartial reading of history. As much as I would want a much more idealized world, and I work towards that. But I know that the politics of life is the politics of compromise. So the signature campaign and the demand under it, even when it is successful and you get 100 on 100, who's going to maintain that line? Nobody. Okay. So getting it executed, implemented, and maintaining your victory sometimes becomes work in itself. So nobody wins completely, and let that not disappoint you and demotivate you, because what else would we do? This is our work, right? And that is what
Yeah.
keeps us active, healthy, and happy. So let's approach it with the labor of love that we have adopted.
Mhm. I see a lot of people sending questions. And while I am quite inspired, I'm also curious to see what are they asking in the chat.
So why don't
Anybody?
they go ahead and more people can send in questions?
Yeah, I think you can also unmute yourself, Rish.
Yeah, you can just
Yeah.
directly, like, yeah. And if you feel I've said anything which is incorrect, off center, or like contrasting with your politics, please go ahead and challenge me. There's no tone policing, there's nothing like that. I've taken over moderation duties also for temporarily. I've suspended Archel by veto. Okay, so please go ahead. And if you agree with something as well or have a different perspective to add, please go ahead and do it.
I see a comment from Rishi and Shubhangi. Um,
Okay, let's take Rishi's one first. So
yeah.
Rishi asks that I came across internet as a non-tech field of study in this last year, and I found it really interesting. I'm currently interested in building trust and inclusivity in the realm of internet. Uh,
Actually, that was an introduction more than a question. Josin asked us to introduce ourselves.
Yeah, we have
So,
a question from Shubhangi, which is interesting, I think. So I'll just maybe read it. Maybe I'll just look at the questions and leave you guys
Please
free
go
and
ahead.
engage with it. So, yes, I think what she's asking is regarding social media platforms, right? So, because they're private and they serve corporate interests, they tend to toe the line. I mean, that's a classic, state and market issues that we face, right? So when it comes to activism and taking them to court, what kind of redressals can we really expect, since the system of law kind of tame them in the current scenario.
It's a little complex. The first thing is that what people need to realize is that social media platforms have revenues which even eclipse the GNP or the GDP of several countries by itself. So the amount of power, market power which they have is immense. And it's not only market power, it's media power. It's the study of the platform as not only a market device, but also as a media ecosystem in itself, rather than a media participant, where it's designed its own ecology. Okay, so you need to consider them as being extremely powerful. So the third element here is democratic legitimacy. Do they have the democratic legitimacy to hold this power? and make decisions which concern either your privacy, data, or free expression. And quite often they lack that, right? But they're large private corporations. So the first thing which is required is a clear study of what are their financial incentives to take decisions. And I don't think so there's enough scholarly thought around that or work around that sufficiently, which is now getting bridged more and more as people are becoming critical. Because the first phase of the rise of technology platforms was one of hoorah, of wow, technology is a liberator, where the inherent political value was of leapfrogging historical barriers which has set back social justice, fraternity, liberty, freedom of speech and expression. So they were supposed to be the pallbearers of individual freedom, liberty, and democracy, rather than being the torchbearers which were leading it to its funeral. Now, we realize that the path which is being determined for it is actually one of power and profit, and is not inherently virtuous or one of vice. And quite often, due to the existing concentration of power, it leads to a certain set of inequity, which has been there with even with monetary frameworks. And if you look at monetary finance and international and how it's developed over a period of time. If you read about the history of money, for instance, you'll come across very clearly what it did to society. So that's the same thing with data. Now, what can be the response by democratic government? It's to center all policy and regulation with a degree of humility that we don't understand everything. Technology is racing off in areas where it can drastically improve our lives. For instance, this call, which would not have been possible. So it needs to permit it that degree of flexibility. But at the same point in time, when social impact and harm happens, to study it and then to regulate it, to bring it within a system where there is a level of regulation. And a lot of it is revisiting arguments which were done from Ludism towards how Mills in Manchester actually then spurred a wave of labor protection and environmental regulation, where and so I think we need regulation, but in clearly identified areas. The third and most powerful point here is then what happens to sovereignty. Claims of sovereignty quite often are being made on an incorrect political understanding of the sovereign being the state rather than a representative of the individual being sovereign, where it's being exercised by a democratic government, like with all its imperfections, for the benefits of individuals by itself. So what we see today is unfortunately a cynical basis of platform-based regulation by governments towards aggregating and shifting power away from the platform and the tech companies towards the government. Now, neither is the platform good, neither is the government good. And that is why this collaboration is happening, right? Where each of them don't want to turn over power to the individual, because the individual does not have bargaining power. Your representative is the government, and the government is looking after itself rather than you, right? And at the same point in time, you think that the platform will look after you, but the platform doesn't care about you beyond the point you spend more time on it. So who's looking out for you? I wouldn't say it's IFF, but we sometimes do take them to court. Okay. And other than that, we don't take money from Silicon Valley companies. We hold them to account. When we do take organizational donations, it's all disclosed and it goes into a corpus, so they can't design our program. Okay. And you'll see higher degrees of transparency from us. Also, we have a very interesting funding mix in which we take individual based donations, which are recurring, and we are working with the applicable regulations to make sure that that is the way we go, and we build out something which is donor based, individual donor based. Hopefully in future may even be able to offer voting rights to individuals, like the ACLU is structured, right? So that's why it is important for more IFFs to be there, more champions for to be there. We think we are only we may be one of the we may be a early failure at best, okay, and there'll be more successes which will come down the line, but there's certainly a need for more and more people to act. And fundamental to that is civil society champions, advocates, individual groups, collectives, or organizations who will fill in this gap, which is not being addressed either by corporations or by the state. One more important element is, especially given the students here or the people who are attending, maybe they're in scholastic study, is to look at the quarterly filing statements and the SEC filings, the Securities and Exchange Commission's filings of the Silicon Valley companies. Don't go by what Sundar Pichai and these guys are saying. Go to what they are filing with the regulators, and you will be surprised. Okay, and this is what people don't read, and I'm trying to put it on my Twitter timeline again and again, that guys, please start reading what they are writing. Don't go to a Business Insider article. Look at the regulatory filing.
Thanks, Apar, for sharing that model and being really humble about it. And I think we really need a lot of IFS in the future as well. So we have 3 hands raised. Would you like to take all together? Like, can maybe just see the question?
We'll do one after the other.
All right, sure. Yeah. Rishabh, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I think you mentioned this already in your talk, and I think your latest segment sort of answers my question already in part, but I would like to still go ahead and ask it. So I mean, compliance with current laws and updating the current laws to be better is a fight of its own, but with developments in technology, there is a need for laws in the first place. And we've seen it especially in the case of, say, for example, the facial technology, recognition technology, and like with the recent farmer protest, how it was used to target and stifle dissent. And I think IFF also sort of wrote to the government regarding this, as there were no laws in the first place to sort of impose checks and balances on the government. So could you talk about your fight, and also about how do you get the government to sort of curtail itself in matters such as these?
The first part of any kind of policy making is to know the field of work, for which you need transparency and you need to study it. It needs to be evidence-based. So we have started mapping it. What is facial recognition technology, more technically as well as in terms of its deployment by state entities. The second is what are its potential impacts. Again, that comes to scholarly study and technical design. And the third is, and these happen contemporaneously. It's not like A, B, C, but I'm sorry I said first, but it happens a bit much more fluidly. And we have this entire project to map them out. We're filing RTIs. We are also going through Ministry of Corporate Affairs filings, going through tenders which are put out by state and central government. So we are integrating various data fields, pulling that out, filing RTIs, sending representations, and the core reason why there needs to be a law to other participants on this call prior to any kind of gathering of personal data, which may include facial recognition, is as per the Puttaswamy judgment, because you have a natural right of privacy, and anything which restricts privacy, which may be even gathering of data for a beneficial use, needs to be on the basis of authorization by law in favor of the government. And what will that law do? It won't say that the government can do whatever it wants. It specifies a use. Why are you doing it? Okay, so when you have this core question answered, you also have a limit defined, a purpose defined, and purpose also then gives it a level of democratic objective. You can't basically do facial recognition to identify who are members of minorities, right? So this is why we need laws in the first place by itself. And then it also permits a level of judicial review. Now, this is a 101 civics lesson, but that's why you do need a law. I'll just stop it here, right here, and we can take the other questions.
Rishi, would you like to go next, and then we can go to Roshan?
Yes, I would like to go next. My question is with regard to a series of suspensions by Twitter accounts in the past, in this year to be exact. So when the Capitol insurrection happened, and as soon as like Donald Trump was like behind the scenes. It was like seen as Donald Trump was behind the scenes. Twitter suspended the account. So that was something which I saw it in a good light. But then recently during COVID crisis, like accounts like Caravan got suspended, which is something really bad. So what is the framework in which the Twitter can suspend or not suspend, like ideally? Because right now they say it is violating against the company policies and they shut it down. So what can be done about that? And second, even if they don't suspend, they can simply stop boosting the post, which in itself would have a lot of effect on what sort of impact do certain organizations have. So how do you approach these areas?
So one interesting thing, Rishi, in fact, facial recognition was also used in the Capitol insurrection by police departments to identify people who had caused violence. So it put a very interesting question mark on the growth and development of regulation regarding facial recognition in the United States, with several municipalities and state governments actually banning them for law enforcement. Now, the thing is, if you have one beneficial use of a technology, but on balance, it's just not the right power for a public authority to have. Do you do a trade-off? Do you limit its use? And does it go and serve the kind of benefit which is always being promised? And this is the same question which a lot of the litigators who actually started agreeing with their representations in the Aadhaar case also faced. Okay, especially the ones who are post Aadhaar. Aadhaar by itself is a promise of system delivery which has never been done before to individuals who have always been disenfranchised from that system. This is the state objective: financial inclusion, deliveral of PDS systems, and when you bring in arguments such as privacy, digital rights, or even exclusion, people say privacy. Poor people, you give them food or you give them privacy, they'll choose food, and you never counted them. And third is exclusion. There's always been exclusion, right? So on balance, what gives? The issue again, and I go back to Aadhaar a bit, I won't labor on it, is that when you go through these justifications a little deeply on the basis of firstly evidence, pure evidence, as per the plain and the variables which are provided for the justifications itself, they break on basic elements of data and rationality and reason. So for instance, if you give a poor person privacy of food, very few will say that, hey, that's a choice. A poor person will like a democratic choice, which is having a better field of options. And it's not like poor people lack in dignity. That's the first thing they search for, in my experience, anecdotally. So if you do a perception mapping study, they'll say that we will work in a place which offers us dignity but less pay. And that's been the consistent experience given what is the caste stratification in the society. I don't want to refer studies, but that's one. The second is, let's take exclusion for instance. Can exclusion be done and has always been done? But is that the principal source of denial of basic services to people? Or that famous Rajiv Gandhi quote that only 1 rupee out of 10 rupees reaches the poor? So John Reyes, who's done work on this, actually says that this was not the quote, firstly. Okay. And the second is that his work with Ritika Khera actually shows that the core fraud in PDS systems which take place is quantity fraud. It's called katauti, which is the unofficial surcharge charged by a dealer rather than authentication. So rather than 15 kgs of rice, a person ends up getting 10 kgs. So that's the corruption in the PDS system, rather than people eating more than they should get. And what are they going to do? These people don't have any places to store their food grain, right? And they may sell that in the open market, but then that is not a large category. That is then fraud, right? It's usually from the dealer, and there are better ways to deal with it. So they break on justification. Now, coming to a much more specific question, when you analyze it, is that technology always has inherent value. These kind of blockings and freedom of speech and expression issues which are taking place with private platforms is complex. I don't have ready answers here, but I'm veering more and more towards a conception which is being critiqued by several people as well in the community that I work in. This is my individual view. IFF has not adopted a very clear public view here, is that they constitute as public squares. I draw this from the theory uh, of democratic media ecologies, that we need to conceptualize about how the private public may be sometimes an artificial distinction, and we need to look at the form and functionality of spaces by itself. And if they perform a public function, then they are public function at its very rudimentary basis. This is what it means. And so according to me, Twitter, Facebook, given the large number of people they have, anybody can sign on, and anybody they constitute public squares. They have actively gone and quoted heads of state, diplomatic corps, press publications. You claim this is the place where news breaks. People coordinate for disaster relief. They get emergency support. It is a public space, right? So when you're taking on those obligations, it doesn't matter to me what shareholder value you serve and what money you make. What concerns me then is that if you're applying any standards of, let's say, hate speech, is it as per consistent human rights norms, and whether it's done transparently and with accountability? Because, hey, your business actually has now become into operation of a space which is no longer private, but is actually enabling people to exercise their fundamental rights, and they also may not have an option of going anywhere else, because each large Silicon Valley platform offers a very unique value proposition and ecology which cannot be replaced by another. Not only because the functionality is unique, but also because of the concept of what is called I'm forgetting this, but I'll come back to it, that it cannot be replaced. It's called I'm forgetting the precise name for that concept, but each network effects, because there's so many people there, people will only go there. So Mastodon can't replace Twitter by itself unless there's data portability which is enforced, and but even that won't happen. So in effect, there is no alternative to the platform, which is why we need to start considering them as public spaces. That's my personal view. And the principles which need to be applied to them are much more consistent with international human rights norms, which draws from the ICCPR. I hope I've answered it. It was very long-winded. But
That's fine. Thanks, Apar. I mean, it is a kind of deep issue, right? I mean, talking about democracy and private spaces, private platforms taking on the role of public spaces, right? We have a question by Roshan.
Yeah.
Would you like to go ahead? Yeah.
Sure. First, good morning. So I had two questions in general. First, about the Aadhaar. So is Aadhaar something that the Indian government tried for the first time in the history and something like that? Or was that something that's already present in other nations already? Because I am a little confused between US's social security number and Aadhaar. So that is one doubt that I had. And the other one is almost everyone is interested in our data nowadays, starting from the government to even companies. They want to know what purchases we make. Amazon wants to know what time we put something in a cart, what time we removed it. So in the light of that, is there any solution that we have, or are the regulations a solution which we can hope to keep our data safe, or anything on those lines? Because I think recently Amex and Diners Club were sort of, I think, put on hold, or they are not allowed to have any more users to their credit cards because they do not store their data in India. So they refuse to comply with that. So I think this is what the latest thing I heard. So in light of that, are regulations a solution? And I think the social security one, you have put down a link. Thank you so much.
So on the first question by itself, Anumeha Yadav has written a well-researched piece in Scroll on the comparisons between the social security number and Aadhaar project. And I've pasted a link towards that. I would not like to paraphrase it. You can read it. And she indicates how both are distinct. And while identification is necessary uh, for at least fiscal projection and allocation in centralized planning. For instance, the social security number being outgrowth of the New Deal, but even at uh, in that respect, the social security number is fairly distinct from Aadhaar. It can't be used as Aadhaar is being used today, and it's also gathering lower amounts of personal data. So you may like to go through it. The second is with respect to data localization, in which you are indicating that is data localization good or bad, or it may lead to uh, services not being available to people in India. Well, data localization is also a nuanced policy conversation. I'm not opposed to data localization per se, because it depends on the class of data. And I follow, this is my personal view, not the IFF view. I follow the model suggested by Professor Graham Greenleaf, who teaches at the Queensland University. And he states that there's certain classes of data, for instance, critical infrastructure data, which should never leave the country. For instance, Aadhaar data, does it make sense if it resides in a foreign server, right? No, it doesn't. It needs 14-foot high walls. Joke. Okay, so bad one. But here's the thing: medical data, financial data by itself uh, may be restricted from transfer abroad, or may be processed and then deleted from transfer port. And we need to also consider that there's not only a political or a geostrategic element to this conversation, there's also a technical aspect to this conversation, because there are certain data flows which happen, which are routed through distributed networks, which is what the internet is. It's packet switching, which is happening in the most efficient way. So it won't follow a predetermined path unless you determine that path and you create that network infrastructure in that particular manner to make sure that the information is flowing in a particular way. Okay. Now, let's consider this. And the second thing to consider is that there's an economic basis as well, where certain jurisdictions may provide a high degree uh, of cost to certain computer intensive applications on the server side as compared to another, thereby permitting a higher degree of value to the recipients of those services, quite often given that a lot of the processing for uh, internet-based applications is taking place at the end of the server uh, through cloud architecture. Now, what is the possible solution to this is to classify data and to also prescribe different forms of data localization, which are what is called as hard data localization. Data never leaves India. Medium type of data localization. Okay, you can leave India for processing, but comes back. And soft data localization. It should be mirrored in India, so law enforcement can have access, etc., etc., or users can have access when data protection authorities ask for it. And who will determine all of this? Will be a data protection authority, which is an independent regulator, which is set up. Now, I'll just stop here, and I hope that answers some bits of this question. There's enough work which is being done around this, and feel free to engage with us at the forum on internet freedom, and you can register there. Our entire staff is there. There are other volunteers, people from the technical community also from Bangalore, social science types like us, liberals, and conservatives. Okay, let me also smile on that. But please do engage. And this is a community-based work which we do at IFF. And I hope you've enjoyed this interaction today.
I deeply enjoyed it. Jofen.
No, I mean, we are done with time. Apart. Do you have 2 minutes? I thought I'll ask just a closing question so that we can.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, just to tie in.
I just wanted to be mindful of participants.
Yeah, that's fair. But I mean, you've been the guest and the moderator, so we didn't have to do much at all. But just to tie in what Anchal and the kind of conversation we were having and what some of the concerns the others had, and something that I've been also thinking about a lot, not just from an educational perspective, but also from the idea of how do we have a more deliberative culture, right, or more of deliberative democracy, and the kind of how we can use online spaces for that. And I think one of the things that I realized also that while we have information infrastructures, they're also perform the function of being pedagogical, right? They're also pedagogical structures.
Yes.
So your WhatsApp, your misinformation. I mean, that's one of the biggest crises, right? How do you unlearn, like what the kind of information you get? How do you assess legitimacy? And against that, you have spaces like IFF, which are trying to do that educational work, right? The kind of work you're doing with Dhruv Rathi is actually educational, helping people understand the language and also kind of engage with what is seen as technocratic and something that we don't get. There's a kind of mysticism around it.
So the first thing I'll just respond to it very quickly is that Jofen, is we need to and sorry, I'm talking over you, but we are not talking to people in the way people talk. People talk through emotion. They don't talk through rational evidence-based policy dialogues. And even when we talk to friends after we are down a few pegs or whatever things people take to loosen up, food maybe, but the thing is, we talk and connect on the emotional way. And who knows this better than Mark Zuckerberg, whose only course I think most prominently was studying human psychology at Harvard, right? So he's not, but here's the thing, that's what we are trying to do as well. That's why when you go to our Instagram videos, etc., it's a call to emotion, but the base needs to be through evidence and rationality.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, like the question then becomes like, while we have a massive, a space where it is exploited for misinformation, and there is kind of, so many barriers to kind of expressing, your opinions. How can online spaces be used for like collective action, despite the kind of issues we discussed, right? The fact that there is a barriers to access, and there is also surveillance. How can we imagine, at least in India, we can't just talk about India, but I mean, there seems to be this kind of divide even nationally when we talk about surveillance and the kind of opinions we can. So how do we?
It will be very different for a young girl from a minority background in one of the cowbelt states to that same girl, let's say in state which, as per the NCRB data, having a lower incidence of both hate speech as well as gender-based violence. So I agree there are many Indias, but some effective strategies to make this work. The first one is to focus on your own security, right? Know the ecology of the platform. Number two is let's start with security, securing yourself, right? And that's possibly a very important consideration in today's digital world. Okay, use a pseudonym if it makes you feel comfortable. secondly, is growing spaces online, organizing communities, talking to people, searching them out. And the pandemic has, in fact, one of the few things it's done, it's made it easier. It's made people more approachable and empathetic, in my view. People respond to emails now and requests for help much more often, and strangers do respond to you. So go with good faith. The third is don't suffer bullies. Okay, if somebody's bullying you, block them, mute them, censor them. Okay, it's impacting your mental health. Call them out. Don't suffer bullies. Okay, um, uh, because I think there we are mistaking quite often civility in our own actions for the lack of a better thing, for the lack of a better word, in terms of a sense of weakness which can be perceived by another person, right? And that's not weak. And just because people are disagreeing doesn't give them the right to abuse you. And you need to put that out very clearly, especially this is when it's happening to women. And when we see that happening, even for people who agree with our own politics, we should ask them to do better. I think we also carry that responsibility, all of us do. So that's more or less it. With respect to platforms, they have a financial incentive of making you doom scroll, spending more time, okay, pumping up outrage. Because just imagine the kind of food you eat. If you eat a really spicy peri peri sauce for 4 days, you want to eat more spicy food the next day. And that's the same thing with your media diet. Please read The Shallows, okay, which explains how it impacts your brain, social media. And it's not good. This is even before people started noticing this. So it's an excellent book, The Shallows. It explains it from the same perspective, a large amount of analogies about your personal diet towards your media diet, and building communities, like instance self-hosted communities like we're doing at the forum, so sustained conversations can happen there. So know the ecology in which you're working, push it towards much more sustainable, organized communities, which can be organized over emails, instant messengers, or your own self-hosted forums, and take it towards there. So what is our vision here at IFF, and just as a learning much more practically, and ambition is, if we can just organize about 20 to 30,000 people in India talking about digital rights, it's massive, right? And that's what you need. You don't need to reach that tipping point of a million, 10 million. And just imagine, when I talk to friends now and I say, oh, you remember Save the Internet.in? Somebody says, yeah, I sent an email then. Was it of any use, those metrics?
Right.
India's biggest petition. Like, I'm not shitting on my own movement, but I'm just saying that, hey, here's the thing. Let's think about it practically. Did people get activated politically, and were they invested? And if they were invested, why when we are doing work around net neutrality now, people don't care that much? It is a problem, actually. There's no enforcement framework even now, because people thought हमारा काम हो गया, हम जीत गए, हमने एक email भेज दी. Community organizing in digital spaces means active conversations, people having patience, giving up ownership, not projecting themselves as leaders or like messiahs, and actually learning from other campaigners. And the best example of this is actually the climate justice movement, which is being done by teenagers or even people who are preteen now. So let's learn from them. So there's a lot of hope. It's not from the platforms. It's basically in organizing communities, where I say we should put a lot of our energy, especially through digital modes, focus more on emotions, and connecting with people on the level of their political values, but always base it on evidence, because we are working towards democratic objectives, and hoping to improve even when we are wrong. So let's approach it like that. I hope that explains my method to how I approach this, at least.
Thanks, Apar. Thanks a lot. Achal, I would like to just take one.
I'm just thinking how greedy we became with your time apart. Thank you so much for such a delightful conversation. I was taking notes on the side, books to read and things to check out later on. So thank you so
Shallows is
much.
best. Shallows पढ़
Shallows is
लेना.
best.
हाँ
ठीक
हाँ,
है.
बहुत मजा आने वाला है.
Okay. And Roots for Radicals as well. Yeah.
Rules for radicals is good.
Yeah.
And for people who may want to first read around it before reading it, just go to the Wikipedia entry. The rules are extracted there, and you say, this is not a self-help book. This is actually sounding like a very dangerous book. And then you'll say, oh, I need to read it.
Perfect. Uh, Thank you so much for such a wonderful, informative conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you so much for your time today. We'll,
You're welcome. Everyone keep safe and have a good weekend. Okay?
No problem.
yes,
Bye-bye.
Take care.
thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Take care, everyone.